All right, everyone, we're just a little bit early, so I'm going to give it about 10, 15 more seconds, and then I'll do the quick introduction that you're all kind of used to by now, and we'll get this going. All right. All right, everyone. My name is Eric. I will be helping with tech support and moderating this chat. This, as a reminder, the session is being recorded. Uh, I do not work for Zoom, but if you are having problems, please reach out to me and I'll do my best to help you. This session starts with roughly a presentation, and then if there's leftover time, we'll have a Q&A session after that. But whatever happens, it will be ending at the 40-minute mark. If we do have time for questions, there's two ways to do it. You can ask a question in the chat, or in the bottom center of your screen, there is a raise hand option if you would like to ask that audibly. Just keep in mind that to please keep your questions relatively family friendly. Any abusive behavior will result in the removal of the session, and repeat performances will result in being booted from this event without a refund. So with that, I would like to introduce Sebastian Major. He is a high school teacher, musician, and storyteller who has been producing the award-winning Our Fake History podcast since 2015. He has been featured on CBC Radio, podcast playlist, Ottawa Morning, Metro Morning, and out in the open. In his time as host of Our Fake History, Sebastian has interviewed New York Times bestsellers, internationally recognized academics, and even Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees, which is a resume which is so much more impressive than mine. So, with that, I would like to hand it over to Sebastian. Sebastian, take it away.
Thanks so much, Eric. Hello, all, and thank you for joining me for this intelligent speech talk, which I'm calling Frauds, Imposters, and Humbug Artists, and Our Fake History Guide to History's Most Entertaining Liars. Now, as you all just heard, my name's Sebastian Major, and I'm the host, the producer, and the creator of the Our Fake History podcast. Now, if you don't know Our Fake History, the tagline is that it's the podcast where we explore historical myths and try to determine what's fact, what's fiction, and what is such a good story that it simply must be told. And over the years, that tagline has served me fairly well and has provided some much needed guide rails for the show. But I'll admit that I've had to stretch the definition of the term historical myth to keep the podcast fresh over the course of 10 seasons. I usually define historical myths as fictional tales that have been wrapped into the historical record and are often assumed to be true. But historical myths can also take the form of exaggerations that distort our sense of the past, or historical misconceptions about exactly how or why something happened. I also like to explore figures and events that people assume are purely legendary, like people like King Arthur, Theseus, Zorro, or Mulan, and then drill down on whether or not there's a kernel of historical truth at the heart of those stories. So, when it was announced that this year's Intelligent Speech Conference was going to be about deception, I was like, put me in, coach. I've been training for this moment. For the last 10 years, I've been producing a bi-weekly meditation on the slippery nature of truth. And in that time, I've developed an unhealthy obsession with liars. You see, not all historical myths start their life as out and out deceptions. A historical myth can develop out of a mistranslation, the confusion of an overwhelmed chronicler, or simply a centuries-long game of broken telephone. By the same token, a meta-narrative that attempts to explain the long arc of history can be too liberally applied and give rise to popular misconceptions. In all of these cases, no one is consciously lying, but historical distortions still occur. This means that finding something that resembles historical truth is a difficult proposition even at the best of times. But then there are the bits of fake history that have been created by history's greatest fakes. These are stories that have been consciously created to deceive. History is filled with imposters, con artists, hoaxers, and propagandists. Now, these people fascinate me in a way that might be unhealthy. I've said before on the podcast that a lie is like a piece of dark magic that even a child can perform. A lie successfully told changes our reality, or at the very least, bifurcates our reality between those who believe and those who are skeptical. On my podcast, I spend quite a lot of time evaluating historical claims or versions of events that are obvious fabrications. But despite the efforts of dedicated debunkers, there will always be some people who believe the lie. The longer a lie persists, the more it becomes a part of the fabric of history. I couldn't tell you how many times on the podcast I've had to say something along the lines of, the story I told you probably isn't true, but it's all our sources give us. As such, I've become fascinated with the anatomy of an effective deception. What makes for an effective lie? Why do some distortions persist while others die out? I think the best way to understand that is by looking at the history of liars. Con artists, imposters, and hoaxers can give us some valuable insight into the ancient art of lying. I think a good place to start thematically, if not chronologically, is with America's most fondly remembered liar, the showman P.T. Barnum. Before he became a circus impresario, Barnum made a name for himself as a purveyor of hoaxes, playful deceptions, and believe it or not style attractions. He first hit the scene as a master of public spectacle in 1835 with the exhibition of a woman who, at 160 years, was alleged to be the world's oldest living person. On top of that, she was also purported to be the former wet nurse of President George Washington. A key part of Barnum's promotional technique was to plant fake news stories in various papers about his exhibition. This included planting opinion pieces that were skeptical of the claims being made. He basically generated his own controversy and public debate over the exhibition as a way to bring more attention to an attraction that was ultimately just an old lady sitting in a chair. Social media platforms would also eventually learn the same lesson, that a simmering argument has a way of keeping people engaged. In this regard, Barnum was a pioneer. Now, this publicity by way of lying was not the only ethically dubious part of this first big Barnum hoax. The woman being exhibited was an enslaved person named Joyce Heth, who is only around 85 years old, by the way. And she was in no way compensated for her exhibition. Barnum even had the audacity to charge admission for people to inspect her dead body after she passed away. Now, as Barnum's fame grew, so too did his reputation for being a con man. These accusations seem to have eventually triggered a pang of conscience for Barnum, a pang of conscience for Barnum, who eventually felt the need to defend his particular brand of deception. To that end, in 1865, he wrote a book elaborately titled The Humbugs of the World, an account of humbugs, delusions, impositions, quackeries, deceits, and deceivers generally in all ages. His thesis was essentially that there's a difference between a harmless humbug and a full-on scam. A humbug for Barnum was harmless fluffery. The important ingredient that transformed humbug into a scam was the feeling of being ripped off. Barnum argued that if someone tricks you, takes your money, and you get nothing in return, well, that's immoral. But if someone tricks you into paying for something that turns out to be kind of entertaining, well, then it's all good. In his book, Barnum lays out his distinction using some colorful descriptions. But here's one that I find particularly instructive, and I quote, two physicians reside on one of our fashionable avenues. They were both educated in the best medical colleges. Each had passed an examination, received a diploma, and had been dubbed MD. They are both equally skilled in the healing art. One rides about quietly, visiting his patients without noise or clamor. The other sallies out, preceded by a band of music, and his carriage and horse are covered with handbills and placards announcing his wonderful cures. This man is properly called a quack and a humbug. Why? Not because he cheats or imposes upon the public, for he does not, but because, as generally understood, humbug consists in putting on glittering appearances, outside show, novel expedients by which to suddenly arrest public attention and attract the public eye and ear. End quote. So this was Barnum's great plea to the court of public opinion. If he was a humbug, then he was going to prove that being a humbug wasn't so bad. He wasn't a liar and a cheat. He was just lovably tacky. And what could be more American than being lovably tacky? Barnum would have his readers believe that just like that quack doctor, he may be putting on glittering appearances, but he always delivered on his promise, and that promise was entertainment. But interestingly, in that little illustrative scenario, Barnum imagines a type of quack doctor that is still qualified and ultimately does right by his patients. It's a character type that I'm not sure exists in the wild, or if it does, it's incredibly rare. He sidesteps the fact that many of those quacks who put on glittering appearances also end up to be hawking snake oil. Their wondrous cures are often placebos at best and downright harmful at worst. Which brings me to one of the oldest types of con artists we can find in the historical record. You see, I have come to believe that none of us are completely immune to the arts of a con man. Some of us are more predisposed to spiritual cons, while others gravitate to political charlatans. Still others can't resist a get-rich-quick scheme, or some are taken in by hucksters of fake technologies. We all have our soft spot. But one perennial type of grifter that I've encountered in my research is the snake oil salesman, or the health and wellness fraudster. If you look hard enough at any period of history, you will find slimy characters hawking bogus cures. Sometimes these con artists even go so far as to promise the secret of immortality. For a particular personality type, the thought of conquering death is especially attractive. Take, for example, the man credited with ending China's warring states period and forging the first united Chinese state. This was the man who was also famous for building the Terracotta Army, China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. Now, the emperor did not have a reputation for being particularly credulous. On the contrary, the sources seem to agree that he was shrewd, calculating, and distrustful to the point of paranoia. And yet, he had a weakness for snake oil salesmen. You see, after conquering all of China's warring states, he became obsessed with his own mortality. Archaeologists have found official decrees dating to the Qin era, which is between 220 and 206 BC, where the emperor commanded his subjects to start searching rigorously for an elixir of life that could make him immortal. Now, the best story about the emperor's quixotic quest to cheat death comes from the ancient Chinese historian Sima Qian. Now, there's reason to believe that this historian, who was writing a few centuries after the fact, may have exaggerated this story or even invented it to make a point about his own era and the emperor that he served, who was similarly obsessed with artificially extending his life. So, this tale is to be handled with care, but it definitely falls into the such a good story that it simply must be told bucket. So let's get into it. We're told that the emperor's obsession with immortality led to him seeking out the counsel of a man named Zhu Fu. Now, we don't know much about Zhu Fu's origins, other than he came from the state of Qi, and by the time he met the emperor, he was already a famous alchemist and magician. But most importantly, Zhu Fu claimed that his alchemical research had yielded suggestive clues about the secret of immortality. He told the emperor that the secret to everlasting life was located on a magical mountain known as Penglai, where there grew a special herb or grass that was the key ingredient in the elixir of life. Penglai had existed in Chinese mythology for a long time before this point. According to lore, the mountain was on an island somewhere off the coast of China. The gods, known as the Eight Immortals, were said to regularly travel to this island mountain to eat a ceremonial meal. If the island and its mountain could be located, then Zhu Fu assured the emperor that immortality would be his. Zhu Fu just needed some stuff. Now, it's at this point that I really wish historian Sima Chan gave us a bit more information about Zhu Fu. It's not exactly clear how he was able to gain the trust of the emperor or how he was able to convince him of his audacious plan. In Sima Chan's text, it just seems like the emperor, who normally didn't trust anybody, was weirdly trusting of this magician. And this might just be my modern bias speaking, but Zhu Fu, at least as he's presented in Sima Chan, strikes me not only as a charlatan, but also as a total creep. You see, Zhu Fu somehow convinced the emperor that he was only going to find Mount Penglai if he was given a flotilla of 60 large ships and, get this, 6,000 virgins. Now, I've also seen this translated as 6,000 children, 3,000 boys, 3,000 girls. Apparently, these virgins were essential because they provided the voyage with the magic charms necessary to find the island. Now, these numbers are more than a little preposterous, and most experts are skeptical that the emperor had that many ships to spare or could have rounded up that many kids. But according to historian Sima Chan, the emperor gave Zhu Fu everything he desired. The magician then weighed anchor and proceeded to float around the coast of China with his 6,000 virgins for the next 9 years. Eventually, on his fourth grand tour of China, the emperor finally tracked down Zhu Fu and insisted that he make a report of his findings. And this is where Sima Chan really makes this guy seem like a swindler. Apparently, Zhu Fu had a very reasonable excuse for why he had not yet found the secret to immortality. You see, over the past 9 years, he had come very close to the magical island and even swore that he had glimpsed Penglai on the horizon. But he could never get too close because a giant sea monster just kept blocking his path for 9 years. So Zhu Fu requested that the emperor provide him with an attachment of crossbowmen who could shoot at the monstrous fish should he encounter it again. Now, amazingly, the emperor didn't immediately scoff at what clearly sounds like a BS story. Instead, he decided to sleep on it. That night, we're told he had an incredible dream where he fought with a sea god and won. When the emperor awoke, he knew exactly what this dream meant. It was his job to personally kill the sea monster blocking the path to Penglai. So the emperor told Zhu Fu that he would be heading to sea with him and he would be bringing his crossbow. We're told that the emperor traveled along the coast for around 350 kilometers before spotting a giant fish. Now, who knows what this sea creature actually was? Maybe it was a whale or a shark or some other acceptably large marine animal. But we're told that the emperor got it in his sights and killed it with his crossbow. The crew fished the creature out of the sea, and the whole entourage returned to shore. The emperor was now satisfied that the way was clear for Zhu Fu to find Mount Penglai. So, once again, he sent Zhu Fu on his merry way, presumably still with his entourage of now slightly older children. Now, this time, Zhu Fu seems to have had the good sense not to return to mainland China, and after that point, he disappears from the historical record. The emperor himself would only end up living just a few more months after his last encounter with Zhu Fu, dying on the road before completing his final royal tour of his empire. The exact cause of his death is unknown, but most experts think it's highly likely that he accidentally poisoned himself with the elixirs heavy in mercury and arsenic that he believed would keep him alive forever. This may be one of the most ironic, high-profile deaths in human history. But whether or not the story of Zhu Fu is true, it carries a lesson about why some con artists are successful. The con artist tells their mark something they want to hear. They play to their established beliefs or prejudices. They promise that there will be a big payoff right around the corner, so long as you keep faith and invest a little deeper. Once they have someone on the hook, a gifted con artist can really ask for anything, no matter how outlandish, including a creepy flotilla of virgins. Even when the con artist doesn't deliver, a fully conned mark will believe any excuse. In this case, a literal big fish story. The story of Zhu Fu and the first Chinese emperor illustrates a key element of orchestrating a successful fraud: knowing your audience. Qin Shi Huang was an alternative medicine guy, and he got taken by an alternative medicine hustler. What that story does not reveal, though, are the mechanics of a well-told lie. Our historian brushes past the details of exactly how the emperor came to trust this so-called magician. For a better analysis of exactly how you trick someone, especially someone who may be a little skeptical, I'm going to need to jump forward a couple thousand years. For a good demonstration of how a well-told lie functions, I would point you all to the work of the American literary great Edgar Allan Poe. Now, recently on the podcast, I explored Edgar Allan Poe's surprising career as a creator of hoaxes. Some of Poe's best-loved early works were actually newspaper hoaxes that fit in with a trend of literary pranks that were selling papers in the 1830s. But some Poe scholars, like Linda Walsh and John Tresh, have argued that the author was aspiring to something greater with his hoaxes. They believed that he was using these hoaxes to communicate a deeper scientific, spiritual, and aesthetic philosophy. Despite the fact that Poe's secondary education had been patchy and filled with disruptions, he nevertheless discovered a deep interest in science and read voraciously on topics of physics and astronomy. At the same time, he started developing a unique interpretation of these scientific discoveries, an interpretation informed by a belief in the supernatural and some unorthodox religious inclinations. If we accept the analysis of thinkers like Walsh and Tresh, Poe's hoaxes weren't just frivolous stories meant to sell cheap papers. They were Trojan horses carrying an argument for something like a scientific spirituality, perhaps a spiritually guided science. Linda Walsh explains that the true guiding arc of Poe's thinking and writing was, quote, the line at which the stress between art and science become too much, where words failed to describe experience, experience failed to adhere to scientific principle, and words and science and experience all failed to reliably yield what was true, end quote. I love that quote. So Poe's hoaxes were designed in a way that demonstrated how scientific language and a serious, highly specific academic style could be used to convince people of absurdities. However, not all of his literary hoaxes were as successful as others. For instance, one of his first attempts at this kind of hoax was a fantastical story called Hans Fall, a Tale. Published in a magazine called the Southern Literary Messenger, the story was presented as a long-form news story about a Dutch inventor named Hans Fall, who had flown his balloon from his home in Rotterdam all the way to the moon. Now, most of the story was presented as a direct transcript of a letter that had been sent by Hans Fall detailing his journey. This letter was chock full of what seemed like entirely credible scientific details. In it, Hans Fall describes the building of his balloon, its early tests, and the various mathematical and engineering feats involved in traveling from the Earth to the moon. And this is really the crux of the hoax. The Hans Fall letter goes to great ends to prove that this kind of balloon journey is scientifically plausible. He shows the mathematical calculations necessary to predict the orbit of the moon and chart the shortest distance between the Earth and the moon. He also spends many paragraphs explaining the problems with breathing at high altitude and ultimately the vacuum of space. To that end, he gives a detailed description of a specially built air compressor that would allow him to breathe comfortably. The letter concludes with Hans Fall reaching the moon and glimpsing a strange civilization of gnomes inhabiting the surface. Poe's piece then wraps up by quoting some officials in Rotterdam who were hotly debating whether or not the whole thing was a hoax. But the last word is given to an unnamed Dutch scientist who insists that anyone doubting the tale is, quote, ignorant of astronomy, and, quote, the document is astronomically true, and that it carries upon its very face the evidence of its own authenticity, end quote. Now, that last line is very telling. Here, Poe is needling his audience, suggesting that if a reader was skeptical of this tale, that meant that he or she was too ignorant, perhaps too dim-witted to understand the complex science at its heart. This is the emperor's new clothes ploy. The scammer tells you that only an unsophisticated person would think that the emperor is standing naked. If you are intelligent, refined, or educated, then surely you can see the truth of the matter. Now, Poe employed a number of tactics in this piece that often help sell a lie. An avalanche of detail can easily masquerade as proof. Much of Poe's article was scientifically sound, or rather, made use of scientific language and established scientific facts. The passages about the moon's orbit were all in keeping with the best research of the era. All of this can help the author sound authoritative while sidestepping the outrageous claims at the heart of the con. But interestingly, while entertaining, the tale of Hans Fall was not a successful hoax. No one was convinced that this Dutch balloonist had gone to the moon. This was because Poe made a key structural mistake in the construction of that story, at least if his goal was to convince people that the story was true. You see, before the reader is treated to the scientifically dense letter penned by the balloonist Hans Fall, Poe tells us how the letter was delivered. His article begins with a ridiculous 3-foot gnome from the moon, complete with a jaunty red cap, descending in Fall's balloon and dropping off this explanatory piece of moon mail. Now, this works fine as a hook for a fantastical story, but it has the effect of breaking the spell of an effective hoax. You can't start with the most audacious element of your elaborate lie. You can convince people of absurdities. It can be done. But if you lead with the moon gnome, it makes people a bit more skeptical of everything else. Poe learned from this experience, and in 1844, he pulled off a considerably more effective deception known as the Great Balloon Hoax. This was a fake news story published in the New York Sun that declared that the Atlantic Ocean had been crossed in a balloon by the well-known Welsh aeronaut Monk Mason. Now, on the face of it, that seems like a less audacious claim than ballooning to the moon. But ballooning across the Atlantic Ocean is actually incredibly difficult to do, given the tricky nature of piloting lighter than air vehicles. Believe it or not, a successful manned balloon flight did not make it across the Atlantic Ocean until the year 1978. So that means that we literally went to the moon before we successfully ballooned across the Atlantic. But while the claim was incredible in 1844, it sounded entirely plausible. Poe presented his story more like a news article and less like a short story this time out. But from there, he ran the same playbook. The article went into painstaking detail about the construction of the balloon, and in particular, the novel propeller Mr. Monk Mason had built for this long distance airship. It also included a detailed woodcut of the so called airship Victoria to help readers visualize the complex machine. Poe made the strategic choice to attribute this astounding feat to a real person, invoking the reputation of the balloonist Monk Mason to help sell his hoax. Because he was a real person, Poe could draw on Mason's real published journals to flesh out his article with the balloonist's authentic voice. And sure enough, the Great Balloon Hoax seems to have caused a legitimate sensation. The Sun sold a record number of newspaper extra copies that day. The Philadelphia Saturday Courier estimated that the New York Sun may have moved as many as 50,000 copies. Poe would later remember that when the story was published as a special extra, quote, the whole square surrounding the Sun building was literally besieged, blocked up. I never witnessed more intense excitement to get possession of a newspaper, end quote. This time, the spell had been performed correctly, and our reality had been temporarily altered. But it seems that Poe himself was a little unsettled by how enthusiastically people had gobbled it all up. Instead of letting the hoax run and pick up steam, he almost immediately outed himself. A friend would later remember that Poe's initial amusement quickly soured. Before the day was out, Poe got himself drunk on wine, headed down to the Sun building, and shouted at the crowd of eager newspaper buyers that the whole thing was a fake. Now, this is pure speculation, but there's a part of me that thinks that Poe was a little overwhelmed by the dark power of a well-told lie. No matter what, his hoax would have been fairly quickly debunked as soon as anyone checked the story with the real Monk Mason. But for whatever reason, Poe didn't like the idea of the hoax gaining any traction. And to be fair, manipulating reality is not for the weak of stomach. Now, interestingly, Edgar Allan Poe was trying to make a satirical point about science and science writing with these hoaxes. He wanted to show that the language of science could be used to overawe people and get them to accept absurdities. I think Poe was successful in lampooning how authoritative sounding language and a scientific style can give the impression of authenticity. However, I don't think this ultimately works as a satire of science. Instead, what I get from Poe's career as a hoaxer is a clear demonstration of the tactics used by pseudoscientists, and for that matter, pseudo-historians and pseudo-archaeologists. The thing about real science is that it's peer-reviewed. Findings are checked and then double-checked. Experiments need to be repeatable. Pseudoscientists, on the other hand, use the language, style, and structure of a scientific argument to mask a leap in logic that usually happens near the end of their reasoning. Most of these folks have learned the lesson not to introduce the moon gnome on the first page. Take the work of Gavin Menzies, the author of the book 1421, The Year China Discovered America. His book works exactly like an Edgar Allan Poe hoax. His initial proposal that the Ming Chinese had the naval technology necessary to arrive in the Americas before Europeans isn't so crazy. It sounds as reasonable as Monk Mason crossing the Atlantic in a balloon. It's surprising, but not unimaginable. The first few chapters of Gavin Menzies' book details all the impressive specifications of Admiral Zheng He's Ming-era fleet. None of this is disputed by historians. The ships were legitimately impressive, and the long list of specifics helps give the text a feeling of scientific seriousness, or at least the feeling that rigorous research has been conducted by the author. The hope is that by the time you get to the back quarter of the book, you are reading about how. The hope is that by the time you get to the back quarter of the book and you're reading about how Chinese sailors found extinct giant sloths in South America and then shipped them to Australia in the 1400s, you've been sufficiently softened up. You're ready for the moon gnome. Gavin Menzies clearly hopes that if he saves that moon gnome for the later chapters, the readers will be more willing to roll with it. He has no real evidence of a Chinese landing in North America in 1421, but he structures his book in a way that might fool you into thinking that he does. Poe's hoaxes have not made me more distrustful of science. If anything, they show that the real issue is scientific language that has been unmoored from scientific rigor. So, what have we learned? When it comes to executing a fraud, there are many ways that you can skin a cat. There's the P.T. Barnum style of encouraging a spurious debate, creating some fake hoopla to get people fired up about a nonsense controversy and then charge admission. Zhu Fu teaches us that anyone, even an emperor, can be hustled just so long as you zero in on their specific insecurity. Perhaps they want more money. Maybe they have been unlucky in love. Perhaps they simply want to be healthier. For some, like the first emperor of China, the fact that no amount of money or power can stop the inevitability of death becomes an unhealthy fixation. Once you have identified your mark's greatest fear and greatest desire, tell them that all their dreams can come true and the solution is just around the corner. All they need to do is listen to you and give you everything that you might require. Finally, the hoaxes of Edgar Allan Poe demonstrate how the skepticism of a potential mark can sometimes be disarmed using a scientific style and an avalanche of details that give the impression of academic rigor. The lies that often get the most traction are the ones that feel true. Who's to say Monk Mason didn't balloon across the Atlantic? You expect me to believe you expect me to believe that we didn't actually get around to that until 1978? Seems bananas. Now, once you've baited the hook by establishing your authoritative tone and hopefully selling a reasonable sounding lie up front, then you can sell a bigger falsehood down the road. Bide your time, build trust, then introduce your moon gnome. Now, of course, this is just a starter pack for those interested in the mechanics of historical fakes and frauds, but lying is more than of an art than a science, and there are many more examples of historical humbug artists who used entirely different techniques than the ones I've mentioned in this short talk. In the world of historical fakes, 1,000 blossoms bloom. But hopefully, this little tour of some of my favorite historical fakes has given you a few things to look out for as we all make our way through a world increasingly defined by humbug. All right, thanks for sticking around, everyone. How did I do time-wise? I think I landed the plane there.
Yep, just under. You have about a minute, 30 seconds left. So you did that really well. That was really well done. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Which I saw someone ask, which historical hoax do I most wish was real? Great question. Great question. I don't know. I got a minute to think about it. I mean, of the ones I just talked about, like wouldn't it be great if there was an elixir of life? Obviously, right? If the actual cures that were supposed to cure us worked, yes, that would be truly incredible. Also, I love the idea of a Dutch balloonist making it to the moon. I mean, it's preposterous, but I mean, maybe that's what I like about it. Um, yeah, those of what I just talked about, that's what kind of immediately springs to mind.
Well, awesome. Well, Sebastian, thank you for your time today. I think we're all about to break for lunch. So I believe the next session, it's the brown bag lunch session where a bunch of us are going to gather together, speakers, admin, everyone, um, to go just to have a working hour. So keep in tune for that. Again, Sebastian, thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming, everybody.